It's actually the people around the whole world logging onto Netflix last night to find not one, not two, but 3 episodes from the new Harry and Meghan documentary. And after years of speculation, we got to hear their side of the story, their relationship, and also what happens beyond the tabloid.
A single royal absence can sometimes say more than a palace statement. And now, as questions grow around Meghan's place in the monarchy's future, one figure stands at the center of the speculation: Princess Anne. Not because she seeks attention, but because when Anne appears to draw a line, royal watchers listen. There is a reason this story begins with the Princess Royal. Inside the British royal family, Princess Anne has long represented discipline, service, and the old belief that royal duty is not reshaped whenever public emotion becomes uncomfortable. She is seen by many as the keeper of order, the royal who understands that the crown survives not by explaining every private feeling, but by protecting the structure around it. That is why recent discussion around Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, has taken on a sharper meaning. Buckingham Palace has not confirmed any secret decision to erase Meghan from royal history, and no serious royal commentary should present that as fact. But symbolically, her position has become harder to read. She remains part of the royal story, part of the public memory, and part of the family by marriage, yet her active place inside the monarchy's future appears more uncertain than ever. This is not simply about one name, one invitation, or one palace record. It is about the difference between being remembered by the monarchy and being included in its future. A person can remain part of royal history without remaining part of royal planning. A title can remain visible without restoring the responsibilities that once gave it official meaning. And when that line is drawn around someone as globally discussed as Meghan, the consequences are never private for long. For Prince William, the Prince of Wales, that distinction matters deeply. William is not only Prince Harry's older brother. He is the future king, and every unresolved boundary he inherits today could become a test of his reign tomorrow. Some royal watchers believe his approach to the Sussex question is shaped less by emotion than by clarity. That remains interpretation, not confirmed private fact, but it fits a monarchy trying to become smaller, firmer, and easier for the public to understand. And this is where Anne's symbolic role becomes so important. If William represents the future of the crown, and represents the discipline that helped preserve it through decades of change, she has watched the monarchy survive scandal, divorce, grief, rebellion, and reinvention. She understands that royal affection and royal function are not always the same thing. A family may carry emotional history, but the institution must carry public order. That is exactly the distinction Anne has spent a lifetime embodying. The deeper question is whether Meghan's royal future has become a matter of emotion or administration. Emotion asks whether old wounds can heal, whether Harry can rebuild trust with his father and brother, and whether Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet can grow up with a meaningful link to Britain. Administration asks a colder question: who appears in future planning, who receives ceremonial access, who carries official responsibility, and who stands outside the working structure of the crown? Those two worlds do not move at the same speed. Emotion wants space, forgiveness, explanation, and time. Administration wants categories, duties, and boundaries. Meghan cannot be treated as though she never existed within the royal institution, because she did. Her wedding, patronages, tours, and brief period as a working royal remain part of modern royal history. But history is not the same as an active role, and that is the line beneath the entire conversation. That is why even a shift in tone can feel consequential. It can appear through the absence of a role, the careful wording of a statement, or the simple fact that the monarchy's future seems to be moving forward without obvious space for a Sussex return. Royal life is often read through what is not said, and in this story, the silence around Meghan's future role has become one of the loudest details of all. King Charles III stands at the most painful point of that silence. As monarch, he must protect the institution he inherited. As a father, he remains connected to a son whose life has moved far beyond palace walls. As a grandfather, he is tied emotionally to children who carry royal names but live far from the daily rituals of the House of Windsor. Every decision around Harry and Meghan, therefore, carries a human cost that cannot be erased by protocol. Yet Charles cannot govern the monarchy, only through private feeling. That is the burden of kingship. A gesture meant as kindness can become a precedent. A private reunion can become a public signal. A softened boundary can become tomorrow's argument about status, protection, and privilege. The king may wish for peace, but peace inside the royal family must now pass through a world where every photograph, invitation, silence, and seating arrangement is interpreted as evidence of who truly belongs. This is why the story feels larger than Meghan alone. It touches William's coming reign, Catherine's role as a symbol of continuity, Anne's reputation for discipline, and Charles's struggle to balance family sadness with royal responsibility. It also touches Harry, because every conversation about Meghan's royal position ultimately returns to the brother who left with her, defended her, and now watches the institution continue without them. The most suspenseful part of the story is not whether Meghan's past remains in royal history. It does. The real question is whether her name still has any practical place in the monarchy's future imagination. Is she remembered as a former working royal whose chapter has closed, or is there still some narrow space for family connection to soften the meaning of that closure? Buckingham Palace has not publicly answered that question, and perhaps it never will in direct words. Instead, the answer may come through patterns. Who appears beside the king? Who is included in future ceremonies? Who receives public warmth? Who remains distant? Who is spoken of as family, but not shown as part of the royal machine? If Princess Anne's public image tells us anything, it is that the monarchy's old guard understands the danger of half-open doors. A half-open door can look compassionate for a moment, but it can also invite years of uncertainty. That is why this opening chapter begins not with spectacle, but with a line quietly forming. A line between past and future, between family memory and royal function, between the emotional wish for healing and the institutional demand for clarity. And once that line began to appear around Meghan's place in the royal story, the next question became impossible to avoid. Who inside the monarchy had the authority, the courage, and perhaps the burden to make that line permanent? That burden would not fall on one person alone, because inside the monarchy, authority rarely moves through a single voice. It moves through rank, tradition, timing, and quiet agreement. If a line is ever made permanent, it cannot look like personal punishment. It has to look like institutional necessity. This is where Princess Anne's reputation gives the story its first serious weight, and has never been seen as a royal figure who bends easily to sentiment. Her public life has been built on service, discipline, and the old belief that duty is proved by showing up. So when royal observers ask who would understand the importance of separating past roles from future planning, the Princess Royal becomes a natural symbol of that mindset, not because she has publicly announced any secret action, but because her identity is tied to order. And order matters more than many viewers may realize. A monarchy does not run only on crowns, balcony appearances, and grand ceremonies. It runs on diaries, protocols, invitations, patronages, precedents, access, and the internal arrangements that decide who belongs in which room, beside which name, and under which title. These details may seem dry from the outside, but within royal life, they are the language of power. That is why any discussion about Meghan's future position cannot be reduced to whether the family likes her or dislikes her. The real issue is whether a former working role can remain symbolically alive after the practical duties have ended. If old references remain too active, they create expectations. If they disappear too sharply, they can look cruel. Between those dangers sits the palace's problem. Some royal commentators believe this is the distinction the institution is trying to protect. Meghan's historical place is not something the monarchy can honestly deny. She married into the family, carried out royal engagements, and became part of a defining modern royal chapter. But historical presence is different from operational relevance. The past records what happened. The future decides who is still being built into the next phase. For William, this becomes a question of inheritance. The Prince of Wales is not simply watching a family matter unfold. He is watching the shape of the future court being defined before his reign begins. Every unclear role today can become a complication tomorrow. If the next monarchy is expected to be smaller, more focused, and more disciplined, then it cannot carry too many unresolved arrangements from the past. A future king may need compassion, but he also needs a structure his household can defend. This is why the Sussex question reaches beyond Harry and Meghan themselves. It affects the working royals who continue to carry public service, It affects Catherine, whose position beside William is tied to continuity. It affects Queen Camilla, who understands how fragile reputation can be. And it affects Charles, because any boundary drawn during his reign will be judged as both a father's choice and a monarch's decision. Most of all, it affects the public's understanding of what royal belonging now means. Being royal by connection is no longer the same as being royal by function. A family tie may remain, a title may remain, and history may remain, but the working center of the crown may become narrower and less willing to carry ambiguity for the sake of appearances. Royal belonging is increasingly about service, restraint, and whether a person still operates within the discipline of the institution. This is where Anne's symbolic presence becomes useful to the wider story. The Princess Royal represents a generation of service that rarely asked whether duty was convenient. Her example gives the institution a kind of moral language. If one carries royal privilege, one must also carry royal obligation. If the obligation is no longer carried, then the privileges and active references attached to it must eventually change. Still, the human side does not disappear. Harry is Charles's son, William's brother, and the father of 2 children who remain connected to the royal line. Any move that narrows Meghan's active place in the future also touches him, because her royal story and his break from the institution are inseparable. What looks administrative in London may feel deeply personal in California. What looks like clarity to the palace may feel like exclusion to the Sussexes. That emotional divide is exactly why the matter is difficult to resolve. If the palace explains too much, it risks reopening old arguments. If it explains too little, speculation fills the silence. If Harry and Meghan respond publicly, the cycle continues. If they remain quiet, their absence becomes its own commentary. Every route carries risk, which may be why the monarchy often seems to prefer gradual distance over dramatic announcement. But gradual distance can still produce dramatic meaning. A future invitation not extended, a ceremonial role not offered, a public reference not made, or a family moment kept entirely private can all become part of the same pattern. None of those things alone proves a hidden plan. Yet together, they can create the impression that the royal household is no longer trying to leave every door open. And when that impression forms, the story begins to move from personal uncertainty into institutional direction. This is the point where Charles's silence becomes especially important. The king may not need to speak publicly for the tone of his reign to be understood. If he allows the working structure to become clearer, if he permits William's future-facing household to take shape, and if he does not publicly challenge the boundaries around the Sussexes, then the message may not arrive as a statement. It may arrive as a pattern of acceptance. Yet there is danger in that approach. A quiet boundary can look dignified, but it can also look evasive. It allows the palace to avoid confrontation, but it may leave the emotional wound unresolved. Viewers may ask whether the monarchy is protecting itself with restraint or avoiding the harder work of family repair. Modern audiences do not judge royalty only by tradition. They judge it by humanity as well. If the palace is not merely reacting to Meghan, but preparing the monarchy for a stricter future, then the Sussex question becomes a preview of how the next royal era may operate. Less emotional flexibility, fewer blurred roles, less tolerance for public uncertainty, more emphasis on service, silence, and structure. And once that possibility enters the conversation, the story moves into far more sensitive territory. Because behind the visible question of Meghan's place, another issue begins to emerge. Whether the real power inside the royal family is already shifting toward the future king, and whether Princess Anne's hard line on duty may be helping William draw the boundary Charles could never make alone. That possibility changes the entire atmosphere of the story, because once power begins to move toward the future king, every royal boundary starts to carry a second meaning. It is no longer only about what Charles might personally allow, or what Harry might personally hope for. It becomes about the monarchy William is preparing to inherit, and whether that monarchy can afford to keep unresolved questions alive. Some royal observers believe this is the hidden layer many people miss. The king may still carry the emotional burden of being a father, but William carries the strategic burden of what comes next. He has to imagine how every unresolved Sussex question would look inside his own reign. Would it appear as compassion or confusion? Would it be seen as family tolerance or weakness in royal structure? Would it help the monarchy heal, or would it keep dragging the next chapter back into the conflicts of the last one? That is where Princess Anne's influence becomes symbolically powerful, and is not the heir. She is not the public architect of the next reign. But she represents something William may need as the institution moves forward, the credibility of duty without sentimentality. The Princess Royal has built her reputation on constancy, and in a family often judged by emotion, glamour, and scandal, constancy becomes its own form of authority. If Anne is seen as supporting a firmer line, royal watchers understand it not as theatrics, but as discipline. And the pattern matters because Charles's reign is transitional by nature. He spent a lifetime preparing to become king, but he inherited the throne at a moment when the institution was already under pressure. The country had lost Queen Elizabeth II, the working royal family had become smaller, the public mood had changed, and the Sussex rupture had already transformed private family pain into international debate. Charles's task is not simply to rule. It is to steady the bridge between one royal age and the next. This is why the Sussex issue cannot be separated from succession. Not succession in the narrow sense of who comes next, but succession as a transfer of tone, discipline, and authority. The next reign will need a clear story to tell the public. It will need to show who works, who represents, who serves, and who carries the symbols of national continuity. If Harry and Meghan remain emotionally central but institutionally undefined, that story becomes harder to tell. Was this really about one royal relationship, or was it about protecting the narrative of the future crown before it even begins? That is the question sitting beneath the surface, because monarchy is not only preserved by law or ceremony, it is preserved by public understanding. People need to know where the center is. They need to feel that the institution has direction. And when a family controversy keeps pulling attention away from that center, the palace eventually has to decide whether silence is still enough. Catherine's position also gives this shift a quieter emotional dimension. She is not placed at the center of this dispute, and it would be wrong to invent private views she has not publicly shared. But her public role matters because she represents the domestic image of the next reign: family stability, measured service, and continuity beside William. In that sense, every unresolved Sussex debate creates a contrast the public will inevitably notice. One couple stands at the center of the working future. Another remains tied to a contested past that refuses to fully settle. This is where public perception becomes a force of its own. The monarchy may not announce a hard line. It may never say that one chapter is closed forever. But if the public begins to see the working future forming clearly around William and Catherine, while Harry and Meghan remain outside that structure, then the conclusion forms without a speech. The institution does not have to slam a door for people to hear it closing slowly. For Harry, this would mean something particularly painful. If the future monarchy becomes more firmly defined without him, then the issue is no longer only whether he can repair a relationship with his father. It becomes whether he can find any meaningful place beside a brother whose royal future depends on boundaries Harry may experience as rejection. The personal and institutional wounds begin to overlap, and once they overlap, reconciliation becomes more complicated than a conversation. For Meghan, the meaning is equally layered. She may be discussed as the person around whom boundaries are drawn, but the larger system is really deciding how it deals with anyone who leaves official duty while remaining globally powerful. Her story becomes a case study in modern royal separation. Can someone retain symbolic force without institutional function? Can the monarchy acknowledge the past without allowing the past to influence future planning? Those questions reach beyond one woman, one couple, or one family disagreement. This is why Anne's hard-edged image carries such force in the narrative. She represents the answer many traditional royal supporters may prefer: duty first, emotion second, records clear, roles defined, service recognized, ambiguity ended. But even that answer has a cost. A monarchy built only on discipline can appear cold. A monarchy built only on feeling can appear unstable. The challenge is finding the narrow middle, and that middle is where Charles, William, and the wider household now seem to be standing. According to some royal commentators, the institution may be trying to create that middle by separating family contact from royal function. In other words, there may still be room for private human connection, but not for any impression of restored official status. That approach sounds reasonable in theory. In practice, it is extremely fragile because nothing involving the Sussexes stays private for long in the public imagination. A quiet meeting becomes a signal. A missing invitation becomes a judgment. A softened phrase becomes a theory. So the real pressure is not only whether the monarchy can set a boundary. It is whether the boundary can survive public interpretation. If the palace appears too careful, people suspect hidden motives. If it appears too direct, people accuse it of cruelty. If it leaves matters unresolved, the story continues feeding itself. This is why the Sussex question has become one of the most difficult tests of modern royal communication. The institution wants control, but the audience wants emotional clarity. But even that does not explain the most sensitive part of the story. Because if the future is already being quietly arranged around William's authority and Anne's philosophy of duty, then the next question becomes far more difficult. What happens when Harry finally understands that the line being drawn is not temporary, not emotional, and not designed for negotiation? That understanding would be the moment the story stopped feeling like a family disagreement and began to feel like a royal consequence. Because if Harry comes to believe that the line around Meghan's future is no longer temporary, then every quiet palace signal becomes heavier. A missing role is no longer an oversight. A careful phrase is no longer harmless. A distance maintained too long begins to look intentional. This is where the pressure rises for everyone involved. For the palace, the risk is not only that Harry and Meghan may feel excluded. The greater risk is that the public may begin to see exclusion as policy. Once that interpretation takes hold, Buckingham Palace loses the comfort of ambiguity. Silence may still protect the institution from direct confrontation, but it can no longer stop viewers from deciding what the silence means. According to some royal commentators, this is why the monarchy's internal discipline has become so important. If the working family is being shaped around the next reign, then every blurred connection has to be examined before it becomes a future problem. A royal household can survive criticism, but it struggles when the public cannot understand its own rules. And in the Sussex story, the rules have always been the most difficult part to explain. Was Meghan being kept at a respectful distance because the role had ended, or because the wounds were still too raw? Was Harry being treated as a private family member, or as a prince whose past could not be fully separated from the institution? Was Charles leaving space for warmth, or allowing the future king's household to form without interference? None of these questions has a simple answer, and that is why this moment feels dangerous. The turning point is not a dramatic announcement. It is the possibility that the palace may now be moving from emotional hesitation into practical arrangement. The monarchy does not need to say that one chapter is closed. It only needs to plan, as if the chapter no longer belongs to the working future. Future ceremonies can be shaped without expectation. Public duties can be distributed without uncertainty. The household can prepare for the years ahead without leaving room for roles that no longer exist. For William, clarity may be essential. The Prince of Wales is already carrying the image of the next monarchy, and a future reign cannot be built around unresolved emotional exceptions. If he is seen as too harsh, critics will say he allowed family feeling to harden into institutional distance. If he is seen as too soft, others will say he failed to protect the crown from confusion. His challenge is not choosing between kindness and authority, but making authority defensible. That is where Anne's influence, even as a symbol, becomes so valuable. The Princess Royal gives firmness a language older than media conflict. She represents the idea that duty is not hostility, and boundaries are not necessarily revenge. In the eyes of traditional royal supporters, and style makes a difficult line appear less personal and more principled. If William embodies the future, and gives that future a connection to the old discipline that kept the monarchy moving through crisis. But there is also a cost to that discipline. A firmer monarchy may look cleaner on paper, but it can appear colder in emotion. It may reassure those who want order, yet trouble those who still hope for visible family repair. And that is the tension Charles must absorb. He cannot allow the monarchy to look uncertain, but he also cannot escape the image of a father watching distance become part of the royal landscape. This is where the story begins to move from private tension into public meaning. Every palace decision surrounding Harry and Meghan is now judged through two competing lenses. One side sees discipline, the other sees rejection. One side sees a future king protecting the crown, the other sees a brother closing ranks. The same pattern creates opposite emotions, and the monarchy must live with both. The danger is that public perception does not wait for official confirmation. It collects fragments and turns them into belief. If Meghan is not seen near the royal center, people interpret it. If Harry's relationship with the family appears strained, people build theories around it. If Charles remains careful, people wonder what he cannot say. If William appears steady, people ask whether that steadiness hides something harder. This is precisely why some observers believe the palace needs firmer boundaries. A royal household cannot keep reorganizing itself around every wave of commentary or allow global attention to decide who belongs in future ceremonial life. From that perspective, the narrowing of Meghan's active place is not punishment. It is an institutional correction after years of uncertainty. But to others, any hardening around the Sussexes risks turning a family dispute into something historically sadder. For Harry, the emotional consequence would be severe. If the line is no longer designed for negotiation, then every attempt to challenge it may only prove the palace's point that clarity is necessary. If he pushes too hard, critics will call it pressure. If he remains quiet, the distance deepens. There is no path that allows him to be outside the institution and untouched by its decisions. For Meghan, the consequence is more symbolic but no less powerful. Public fascination can keep a name alive, but it cannot create an official role. It means Meghan can remain central to royal conversation while becoming less central to royal planning, and that imbalance may define how history remembers this chapter. The strongest turning point is not that someone is dramatically removed from memory. That would be too simple and, without confirmation, too careless to state as fact. The real turning point is subtler and perhaps more lasting. The monarchy may be learning to separate memory from function. It can acknowledge that Meghan was part of the story without building future decisions around her. It can recognize Harry as family without letting his unresolved conflict shape the next reign. That is a serious shift. It suggests a royal household preparing to survive, not by repairing every relationship, but by reducing the relationships that can destabilize its public purpose. It suggests a future where personal affection may continue privately, but institutional access becomes narrower and less negotiable. And if that is the direction of travel, then the Sussex question is not an exception. It is a warning about how the next era may treat every blurred royal role. But even then, one question remains unanswered, and it is the question that could define the entire story. If the monarchy has chosen clarity as the price of survival, what does that choice mean for those left outside the line? And what kind of crown will emerge when duty finally stops making room for uncertainty? That uncertainty is where the final meaning begins, because a monarchy that chooses clarity over uncertainty is not simply changing one relationship. It is changing the rules of belonging itself. And if royal observers are right, the most important consequence may not be what happens next with Meghan, but what the palace has now learned it must never leave unclear again. For centuries, the royal family has relied on a delicate balance between blood and duty. Family connection gave the institution its emotional power, but service gave that connection public meaning. A prince, princess, duchess, or duke could not simply exist as a famous name. They had to represent continuity, restraint, and the belief that privilege was justified by obligation. Once that balance is disturbed, the royal story becomes harder to explain. That is why the Sussex question has become so revealing. It has forced the monarchy to confront a modern problem older systems were never designed to handle. What happens when someone remains globally royal in public attention, but no longer royal in daily function? The palace can define roles internally, but it cannot force the world to stop watching. It can draw a boundary, but it cannot guarantee that everyone will accept what that boundary means. This is the space where Meghan's name becomes larger than Meghan herself. She becomes a symbol of the modern royal dilemma: visibility without service, title without active duty, family connection without institutional participation. Some viewers may see that as unfair, because no person should be reduced to a symbol. Others may argue that royal life has always turned individuals into symbols, whether they wanted that burden or not. For Harry, the final meaning may be even more painful. If the line around Meghan's active royal future continues to harden, then he is not only watching his wife's position shift. He is watching the monarchy define how far his own separation has truly gone. A family may still leave space for affection, but an institution may no longer leave space for ambiguity. That difference is small in language and enormous in emotion. Charles remains caught between those meanings. As king, he may understand why the working structure must be protected. As a father, he cannot be untouched by the cost. This is the tragedy hidden beneath many royal decisions. The crown often requires people to appear settled before they are healed, moving through ceremony and duty while private questions remain unresolved behind the scenes. William's role makes the conclusion sharper. The future king is not merely preparing to inherit a title. He is preparing to inherit a public system that must look disciplined enough to survive. If his reign begins with unclear boundaries, the monarchy risks appearing vulnerable to old conflicts. If it begins with discipline that feels too hard, it risks seeming emotionally distant. His challenge will be proving that order and humanity can exist together. That is where princess and symbolic importance reaches its final purpose, and represents the kind of royal discipline that does not need constant explanation. She shows the public an older belief that service is not a mood, not a brand, and not something carried only when convenient. Many people see her as the royal figure least likely to confuse affection with function. Still, the monarchy cannot survive on severity alone. Its power has always depended on emotional imagination. People watch because they see families, wounds, loyalty, forgiveness, disappointment, and hope reflected through a crown. If the institution becomes too cold, it loses the human story that gives it meaning. If it becomes too sentimental, it risks losing the discipline that gives it authority. This is why royal observers may now watch for smaller signs rather than grand announcements. They may watch whether family references become warmer or more distant. They may watch whether Harry and Meghan appear in future ceremonial contexts, even indirectly. They may watch whether Charles creates private space for contact without allowing it to look like official restoration. They may watch whether William's public role continues to tighten around a smaller working family. The public reaction will remain divided because this story offers no easy moral comfort. Supporters of the Sussexes may feel that the palace has failed to make enough room for healing. Supporters of the institution may feel that firmness arrived late, but finally arrived. Others may stand somewhere in the middle, seeing a family wound that became too public, too complicated, and too symbolically dangerous for any simple reconciliation to repair. And perhaps that is the true lesson of this chapter. A monarchy can remember the past without allowing the past to govern its future. It can acknowledge pain without reopening every structure that pain once touched. It can keep family ties alive while still refusing to blur official roles. But every one of those choices leaves someone dissatisfied because clarity is rarely gentle when it arrives after years of uncertainty. So the final question is not whether Meghan has been erased from royal history. She has not. No serious reading of the modern royal family could pretend that her chapter did not happen. The deeper question is whether the institution is deciding that memory is enough, and that function must now belong only to those who remain fully inside the working life of the crown. If that is the direction of travel, then the story marks more than a Sussex turning point. It marks the beginning of a stricter royal age. In that stricter age, belonging may be measured less by title and more by service. It may be measured less by bloodline and more by usefulness to the public role. It may be measured less by emotional history and more by whether a person strengthens or unsettles the future image of the monarchy. That is a profound shift because it suggests the crown is no longer willing to let unresolved family conflict define its path forward. For Charles, that may mean accepting limits he would not have chosen as a father. For William, it may mean carrying decisions that make him appear harder before he ever becomes king. And it confirms the painful authority of duty. For Harry and Meghan, it may mean facing a royal future where family connection survives, but official meaning grows smaller with every passing year. So what do you think? Was this simply one royal development, or does it point to a much larger shift inside the monarchy? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep royal analysis, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary-style royal story. Because in the House of Windsor, the most lasting decisions are not always shouted from palace balconies. Sometimes they are revealed by the quiet moment when the future stops making room for the past.